Across the endless fields of Kursk, the earth and the sky shook under the roar of steel. More than 6,000 tanks from both sides clashed, tearing the ground apart, blasting dust and fire into the air. Day and night became one in a sea of blood, smoke and explosions. This was the largest tank battle in the history of mankind. And it was the irreversible turning point, when Nazi Germany lost the initiative for the last time and began its relentless slide into defeat. This is the Battle of Kursk. After the German catastrophe at Stalingrad, the Eastern Front was left shattered. Entire divisions had been wiped out. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were dead or captured, and the myth of the unstoppable Wehrmacht had been broken. Yet in early 1943, a new opportunity appeared on Hitler's maps. A large bulge, a salient, had formed near the city of Kursk, stretching deep into territory held by Germany. It protruded like a thorn, tempting the Germans to cut it off and restore the straight, clean front line they preferred. To Hitler, this was more than geography. Kursk was a chance to restore the momentum his armies had lost. If he could strike from both north and south, meet in the middle, and crush the Soviet forces inside the salient, he could shorten the front, destroy several armies, and prove that Germany still held the initiative in the east. After Stalingrad, he needed this victory desperately. For him, Kursk was redemption, the battle that would erase the humiliation and show the world that the Wehrmacht was still the most fearsome fighting machine on earth. But in Moscow, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, saw things very differently. Thanks to an effective network of spies and intercepted radio traffic, they knew almost everything about the German plan. British codebreakers had shared ultra-intelligence, and Soviet agents in Switzerland passed on details from inside the German High Command. The Soviets knew where the blow would fall, which units would attack, and even that the offensive was repeatedly delayed, while Germany waited for its new Panther tanks and Ferdinand tank destroyers. Instead of withdrawing from the bulge, the Soviets made a bold decision. They would stand and fight. They would not only absorb the German attack, but break it, and then counterattack with overwhelming force. To do that, they would turn the Kursk salient into a fortress. Through the spring of 1943, the landscape around Kursk changed beyond recognition. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, soldiers and engineers laboured day and night with shovels, picks and explosives. They dug more than 8,000 kilometres of trenches and communication lines. They carved anti-tank ditches across likely avenues of approach. They laid minefields so dense that some sectors contained more than 2,000 mines per kilometre of front. Whole villages were evacuated, forests cut down, and fields flooded to shape the terrain in favour of the Red Army. By July, the Kursk salient was protected by at least 8 defensive belts, stacked one behind another like the layers of an armoured shell. In front were infantry in camouflaged trenches, supported by anti-tank guns hidden in tree lines and barns. Behind them, artillery batteries ranged the likely German staging areas. Further back still, reserves of tanks and mechanised infantry waited for the order to counterattack. It was one of the most formidable defensive systems ever built. Meanwhile, the Germans were preparing their own hammer blow, Operation Citadel. On paper, it looked terrifying. In the north, General Model's 9th Army assembled hundreds of tanks and assault guns. In the south, Field Marshal Manstein's 4th Panzer Army, including the elite 2nd SS Panzer Corps, massed over 1,000 armoured vehicles. Among them were the new Panthers and the heavy Tiger tanks, whose 88mm guns could knock out a T-34 at well over 1 kilometre. But there were problems. The new Panthers were rushed to the front with barely any testing. Many broke down on the march, their engines overheating or catching fire. Fuel and ammunition were limited, and every delay gave the Soviets more time to fortify. Some German generals began to doubt the plan, but Hitler pushed ahead. He believed one last concentrated blow could still change the course of the war. In the early hours of July 5th, 1943, the Germans struck. Their artillery lit up the night, pounding Soviet positions. Then the tanks rolled forward in long lines, engines growling, treads grinding the soil. In the north, the assault quickly ran into trouble. Model's forces faced especially strong defences and rugged terrain. Minefields shattered attacking formations, and Soviet guns knocked out tank after tank. The northern pincer advanced only a few kilometres before bogging down in bitter, grinding combat. In the south, however, Manstein's attack achieved greater momentum. German panzer divisions punched through the first Soviet defensive belt and began forcing their way into the second. Villages such as Cherkasskoye and Yakovlevo became scenes of brutal fighting, changing hands multiple times. Fields were churned into mud and metal, crews bailed out of burning vehicles only to be cut down by machine gun fire or shrapnel. Yet even as the Germans advanced, they were bleeding. Every minefield cost them time and tanks. Their infantry struggled to keep up with the armour. The Soviets constantly traded space for time, pulling back from one line to the next, while exacting a heavy price in German lives and machines. By July 10th, the spearhead of the German southern pincer was approaching the small railway town of Prokhorovka. Beyond it lay open country, the last major barrier before the Germans could hope to break through the final Soviet defensive belt. If they succeeded, they might still encircle large Soviet formations and claim the decisive victory Hitler craved. The Soviets could not allow that to happen. To stop the Germans, the Stavka committed one of its most powerful formations, the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov. Nearly 1,000 tanks, mostly T-34s, assembled behind the front. Their mission was simple and terrifying. They were to charge straight into the advancing German spearhead and smash it head-on. At dawn on July 12th, a low mist hung over the fields around Prokhorovka. As it began to lift, Soviet tank crews received the order they had been waiting for. Engines roared to life. Tracks clattered. Columns of T-34s and light T-70s surged forward, raising clouds of dust. Many crews went into battle with religious icons, or small photographs of their families tucked into their pockets, knowing that they might not return. What followed was one of the most chaotic and violent clashes in the history of warfare. The terrain around Prokhorovka was narrow and broken, with gullies, embankments, and patches of soft ground that funneled vehicles into close contact. German Panthers and Tigers designed to fight at long range suddenly found Soviet tanks charging out of the haze at 200 or 300 meters. The battlefield dissolved into a storm of point-blank engagements. Tanks fired on the move. Some collided or became entangled in wrecks. Others rammed enemy vehicles deliberately, trying to disable them or force them into anti-tank ditches. The noise was overwhelming. The crash of guns, the clank of armour, the hiss of burning fuel. Smoke and dust were so thick that men sometimes fired at the flashes of muzzle blasts, rather than the tanks themselves. By evening, the fields near Prokhorovka were carpeted with hulks of destroyed machines from both sides. Exact losses are still debated by historians, but there is no doubt that the battle cost the Germans dearly in tanks they could not easily replace. More importantly, their advance had been halted. The southern spearhead was spent, and there would be no breakthrough. At the same time, events far from Kursk were changing the strategic picture. On July 10th, Allied forces landed in Sicily, opening a new front in the Mediterranean. Hitler suddenly faced the prospect of Italy collapsing and the war spreading even further. He could no longer justify pouring his last reserves into a single offensive in the east. On July 13th, he called off Operation Citadel. The grand German summer offensive of 1943, the plan that was supposed to restore the Wehrmacht's reputation and seize the initiative, had failed. For the Red Army, this was the moment to strike back. Even before the last German attacks had fully ground to a halt, Soviet commanders launched counteroffensives on the northern and southern shoulders of the salient. Their aim was not just to push the Germans back to their starting positions, but to drive them westward and keep pushing. Now it was the Germans' turn to fight from improvised positions, short of fuel, with dwindling numbers of tanks and aircraft. Towns such as Orel, Belgorod, and finally Kharkov fell to the advancing Red Army. What had begun as a German attempt to pinch off the Kursk bulge ended when the Soviets punched a wide hole in the German line and expanded their own front westward. By the end of the wider campaign, Germany had lost around 200,000 men, thousands of guns, and hundreds of tanks and assault guns, many of them elite models that could not be replaced in sufficient numbers. The Soviets also paid a horrifying price, but their factories in the Urals churned out new T-34s and artillery faster than the Germans could knock them out. In a war of attrition, the balance was shifting decisively. Kursk proved what Stalingrad had already suggested. The era of German strategic offensives in the east was over. From this point, the strategic initiative passed to the Soviets, and German forces were forced onto the defensive for the remainder of the war on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major attack on that scale. Instead, it would be forced into a long, exhausting retreat through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and eventually all the way back to the ruins of Berlin. Today, the quiet fields around Kursk hide the scars of that colossal struggle. Farmers still occasionally turn up rusted fragments of tanks and shells in their ploughs. Faint traces of old trenches can be seen from the air. Memorials and museums mark the places where entire units fought and died in a single day. The Battle of Kursk was Hitler's final bid to change the course of the war in the East. He threw his best units, his newest weapons, and his last strategic reserves into the attack. And it failed, spectacularly. After Kursk, the fall of the Third Reich was no longer a question of if, but when.